Hello, I'm David Brown, Director of Executive Education at Imperial College Business School. And I'm delighted to share with you some highlights of discussions that we've been having with various directors of HR, directors of L&D, and indeed a point of view. So, the conversation is, I thought I had an L&D strategy, now what? Well, for many of us, some L&D, much L&D, has involved in travelling, either on planes, trains, automobiles, and being in a crowded room for several days. That is simply not going to happen. And it's not going to change anytime soon, especially on an international basis. So, what's changed from an L&D perspective? Well, clearly people aren't travelling, gathering in small rooms. We've transformed how we're working. We are online. We are collaborating in different ways using a dozen different tools. There is going to be pressure on budget. This isn't, as we all know, just a health issue. It's clearly going to affect the economics of almost every firm, which is going to put pressure on budgets. And it's not clear that the money saved from travelling is going to be ploughed back into other forms of L&D. Even when we are together, we're going to be socially distanced. We're going to be working in shifts potentially. And so there are going to be new ways of working, and it's got to be more than just sitting at two people talking on a screen. So a lot's changed, which affects most of our plans. And it's not going to be over by Christmas. This is going to take a while. Indeed, elements of it will be a permanent change. So, what are some of the changes we've experienced ourselves that may become permanent? So there are some hard skills that we're experiencing. For sure, IT capabilities. Not just about connectivity, but about how systems talk to each other, how we work. Facilities, our buildings, how we schedule work, budgeting. We've all had to dramatically and quickly change our budgeting, and that's not going to be a one-off. That's going to stay with us, and we're going to need new tools and approaches and thinking to do that. Those with greater process clarity in their firms are finding this a little easier, and indeed governance around decision-making, around security, around all sorts of areas are changing. But it's not just the hard skills, for sure. Most of all, we're experiencing either what happens well when we have the soft skills in place, or indeed when it doesn't. So trust in many, many different areas has become a really defining issue for us, with our colleagues, with those who report to us, with suppliers, customers. Goal alignment, increasingly complex when we are more aligned and having to do new and different things. How we care for each other, it's always been important, but it's even more important now, and indeed even harder in these days. Communication, leadership, performance management is just changed beyond all recognition, and it requires a whole new set of skills. And when we look around us, we see some of us are pretty good at this and some of us are less good at this. But it's not a personal, we're looking at an organizational perspective here as well. And for sure around innovation, there have been some amazing things happening, and indeed some things that have been a little bit more challenging, that firms have simply not responded. So, as we go through this, as Warren Buffett says, when the tide goes out, we'll see who's wearing a swimming costume. And it is becoming increasingly clear that those parts of our firms and those companies that simply don't have a lot or many of those capabilities, and those that do. So we are going to see something happen much, much more quickly. Let me share with you a pretty simple model on this. So if we think about those hard and soft skills, that there are firms there that are not terribly strong on both either the soft or hard skills, and delightful phrase of emerging zombies. They are going to be caught, and it's not going to be sustainable for them at all. there are those firms that are pretty strong on some of the softer skills. And softer skill doesn't mean warm and fluffy. It just means some of how we manage our people. But they may be very strong on the soft skills, but not have some of those harder skills that are required. They may be lovely or even effective to an extent to work there, but going nowhere slowly. Conversely, in bottom right, you can see firms that have got a lot of the infrastructure and what academic calls the hydraulics, the infrastructure of the business in place, but without the soft skills. And very, very quickly, it's going to be untenable. These are not places that they're going to want people are going to work where they're going to be able to keep people. So we need to have this combination of hard and soft skills to give us a shot at the title. It's not everything, but it's a start. So, there's a wonderful quote from Ernest Hemingway. How did you go bankrupt? 2 ways. Gradually, then suddenly. I think we're going to see that. Some of the pains that we are seeing within our businesses are going to be increasingly uncomfortable and eventually will result in a business challenge, or indeed worse. So what do? I passionately believe that this is the moment where our ability as L&D leaders to be able to make a difference in our firms, in our industries, is coming to the fore. It needs a transformation in many cases, a transformation in how we're working. And that, our ability to develop capabilities, is what we're about. So, we have this opportunity, but how? And that's what I'd like to talk about some more. The trouble is, it doesn't always start from a great place. So, this graph you may recognize from GCSE O-level, it's half-life. Much executive education is a waste of time. It has a shelf life of days, sometimes weeks. We spend a few days in the company of some great people, and after a few days we remember some of the people, some of the profs, some of the jokes, but nothing material happens. Now, that's often not true, but we need to change that more than ever and be absolutely certain that the curve is in the opposite direction, that actually the impact builds after we've had the training. And of course the training, whatever intervention, is going to be more longer lived in a good design. So we've got to change that. And indeed, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We've got to do something differently. Otherwise we're going to be found out, and rightly so. So, let me share some observations around a learning strategy. So, clearly and desperately importantly, our learning strategies have to be grounded in the firm's strategic objectives and priorities. That sounds a statement of the compelling obvious. It just simply isn't true in many cases. Oftentimes our learning is what we've done in the past or what some individuals have been championing. And the reason this happens is it's actually quite difficult to understand how learning is going to contribute to the strategic objectives and priorities. It's a really important activity. It's a consulting activity. It's something that we've invested a lot in, but it's not something I want to talk about today. The second area is content, which is really making sure we've got the right content. It will be company specific, but there are some general themes, and I'd like to explore that a bit today. A third area that I think is profoundly important, and that as an industry we have not addressed as much as we might, is around whole company change. I think oftentimes we've gone for point solutions for specific groups at specific levels. I would argue that capabilities from great companies are from top to bottom. And so taking a narrow approach to L&D has some challenges to it, and I'd like to explore that a little bit better. I'd for sure like us to talk a little bit about execution and delivery model, strategy as execution being critically important. And I think we have some new paradigms that I'd like to explore. And then, of course, lastly, it's about reinforcement mechanisms, which links to whole company change and indeed measurement. That's a whole nother topic, and actually that's one that we're not going to talk about today. So, I have a habit. Colleagues say, this is the most important slide. Well, there are several most important slides, but this is one of them. So thinking about the strategy, there are some technologies that we need to know about. It's just not sufficient to rely on consultants or our IT department or a narrow band of experts or early adopters. So what are those technologies? And they're not always new technologies. It's often some of the old technologies that have suddenly become more high profile. Big data, AI, blockchain, and cloud. And we all need to have some sense of what those technologies are. But we also have to ask the perhaps more difficult questions, which is who in the organization, by level, by function, by geography, who in the organization needs to know how much and when. Because my belief is that on really key areas, some hard and some soft skills, the whole company needs to have some familiarity. So firstly, there's a question of what technologies and to what level. The second thing, we know that innovations, that big or small, are rarely the function, rarely the outcome of a single technology. So we shouldn't be fanatical about understanding a single technology. We need our managers and leaders to be able to understand how these technologies fit together. So we need examples of that from the past, and we need to help managers think through how might technologies combine, because that's where the magic happens. If we think about any innovation, it's generally the combination of several different areas. And then we need to think, so what? What does that mean? What are the possibilities by company, by industry, by function, indeed by ecosystem, because we need to think more broadly about industry boundaries. And then where we might create value, what new products and services, and what can we create and not automate. I mean, it may be part of automating, but this is not about necessarily cutting jobs. So those are some strategic questions that we need to help people explore from an L&D perspective. But then how do we move on from that? How do we prioritize? How do we gain agreement and execute? And how can we be specific about what organizational capabilities are required? So I've touched on some of the sort of harder skills. It's clear they need to be combined with some of the softer skills. And some of these are ever more important. You will have your own list for your own company, given the culture where you're at. But things around resilience, adaptation, courage, there are many others, are increasingly important given the current environment. But there are some other new ones. The coaching and develop people may sound a case of we've been doing that for years. But in the current environment, it's addedly important and particularly complex, or difficult perhaps. Diversity has a whole new flavour. We're familiar with many of the parameters of diversity, but it's increasingly people who can and can't work at home, people who have different family circumstances, who have different health circumstances. So there's another level of complexity we need to get better at thinking about. And of course, how we manage ourselves, our teams, is also changed in the current circumstances. And then there are some more that are genuinely new. I think ethics has always been important, but it's particularly important now and more complex around machine decision-making, privacy, security. sustainability's here. I think it probably should be on both sides, but that's another for another discussion. But these are critical competencies which I think we need to explore in a bit more detail. So, talked a little bit about some of the topic areas and spend a bit more time. I want to touch on this idea of a whole company change. All really important capabilities are for the many. They are whole company capabilities to varying degrees, from the most junior on the shop floor, on the factory floor, at the analyst level, all the way through to senior levels. And they build and build as you go through different experiences. So, really critical that the whole company gets familiar with things. The second area is that we know that one of the greatest challenges in most organisations is the ability to work across teams and functions and indeed geography. And in these changed days, that challenge becomes even more acute. And those firms that cannot address that challenge will be challenged. And part of that is, I think, around language, not English, French, German, but around what we mean when we speak about things. Definition of the terms is the start of wisdom. And it's not a question of writing down. I was speaking to one pharmaceuticals firm recently, which is say, we just need a lexicon of terms. It's not that. It needs to be at that and some, another level of understanding, so that people can actually speak in the same language, so that they know what we mean by cloud, business analytics, and so forth. So, absolutely key. So that's part of the reason I think this end-to-end insights and indeed learning is very, very important. So if this is important, if these areas, what is the critical role of L&D? So to summarise a little bit, it is our role to democratise, if you want, to share capability across the organisation, and that is in part, not in whole, but in part, a function of L&D. To accelerate alignment, adaptation and coordination, those are three specific and indeed different sort of strategies, and knowing which one is most important is critical and indeed feeds into the L&D strategy. To speak the same language, to be able to work across barriers, and to have a shot at the title. Why wouldn't we? So this is our opportunity. So one of the challenges, this perhaps is a slide to be read later rather than now. It's C.P. Snow in 1959. And it speaks to the fact that how sometimes siloed or we can not know things. The great edifice of modern, in his case he was using an example of physics, but it could be any of these technologies that are important to the future, goes up, and the majority of the cleverest people in our businesses have about as much insight into it as their Neolithic ancestors. Now, I hope I'm exaggerating to introduce that idea, but we have too many people who indeed don't have the language of the enabling and core technologies. And I would include innovation. It's not specifically around a single technology. So what do we do about it? Okay. I think we need an integrated approach. Of course, it's part of the response. But I think there are 4 specific building blocks and one capabilities, if you like, that we need to combine. One is an understanding of the technologies in the broader sense, and we need to be able to access that. So that needs to be core to most programs. The lead management and leadership, there are many things, and we've touched on them already, that we need to bring in. It's not an either or. And bringing those two together in this culture of innovation and experimentation. I think it's very encouraging, actually, that business is starting to use the language of experimentation, which of course has its origins in the scientific method. So, and we're starting to see that in business, which is quite encouraging. So, technology, innovation, leadership, and of course an L&D capability. And in many ways that's more and more demanding, the types of things that we need to be able to do. So if we could combine those, whether it's using resources within the firm or outside the firm, then that gives us a chance at capability creation. But I want to talk a little bit about how. So I've argued that there are specific new technologies, that there are soft skills that are critically important and even more so now, and that we need those in combination to make a difference. Now, let me move more towards how do we do that, and particularly sort of delivery vehicles. In the past, we have operated in a set of constraints, particularly around digital learning, online learning, synchronous versus asynchronous. You can see various areas on that. And I think many of us have had this idea that one set of learning is effective and cheaper, and the other is less effective. I think that paradigm is wrong. And it's particularly wrong given the context of we need to move quickly, and we have different ways of working, and we need a whole company strategy. So one of the challenges, I think, for the L&D function is to understand what those changed constraints or indeed opportunities may be. Some of the trade-offs are driven by a lack of skills in our industry, a lack of understanding of the technology, which of course is what we've been talking about a lot, and sometimes imagination. So, when we think about the future of L&D, let's explore a little bit this trade-off between sort of people-based and technology-based. And I'd like to suggest some criteria if we are going to use a blend of face-to-face and online. Because I think a lot of the online that we've seen, or the virtual, particularly the response over the last 2 months, has been really not engaging. In fact, dire. So I'd like to suggest some criteria to make it effective. I think it has to be personal. We are social creatures. We learn, for the most part, by collaborating with each other, by creating things together, by interacting. And there are dozens of ways of interacting. So it's clearly got to be personal. And it's got to interact with the learners, with experts. From an Imperial perspective, that's often faculty, but it's also practitioners as well. So it's that combination, plus somebody to facilitate the learning. So those 3 or 4 areas are really key. It's got to be simple. It's got to be really easy for the learner. We have very, very high expectations in our consumer technology and apps. And it's got to be as easy, if not even easier, from a corporate perspective. So it's got to be simple, with limited technology barriers and available almost anywhere. It strikes me that often in L&D, we're more constrained by our internal LMS than we are about imagination, about what we might be able to create in the service of our strategy. It's clearly got to be effective. It's just not worth doing. That goes back to that whole half-life thing. It's got to be effective. So it goes without saying, but sometimes it needs to be said. It's got to be affordable for relative to what the benefits that are being created. And by and large, it's a partnership, potentially with for companies, for custom programs with third party, but always with the L&D function, with the organization, and indeed participants. Having participants as part of the design process is pretty key, but so often I've seen missing. So we know plenty about design-centered and user-centered design. So personal, simple, effective, affordable, and created in partnership. So let me share with you what I hope you'll see as a few key takeaways. First, many of the changes that we have seen and experienced are permanent. It is our world, our business world, is going to require new ways of us interacting. And as L&D, we have to be in the vanguard of both understanding and adapting to that. Second, changes that would have taken years are happening in weeks. Now, some firms, because of what they've done in the past, will be better suited to that. But wherever our position, our role as HR and L&D is to help define and build those capabilities. If we don't, or even if we do develop those capabilities, the winners and losers are going to be visible much, much more quickly. That will be at the company level, and indeed it'll be at the functional level. And I'm sure we've all had plenty of experiences of firms that have responded well and have responded less well. That is going to play out faster and more dramatically over the coming weeks, months, and years. We have allowed some of the old interventions to be just not good enough. So we have to be absolutely rigorous. We are all, most of us, working a lot harder than we ever have. And our time, and given the economic environment, our firm's money is even more precious. And we just can't afford time or money to have interventions that don't work. We need to think about new capabilities, and I've touched on some of them, and we need a more integrated approach to combining both management, leadership, technology, and innovation, new ways of doing things. So a much more integrated view. We need, and indeed we have, and therefore we need to access and explore new delivery mechanisms. And there are some profoundly different mechanisms, but we need the curiosity and imagination to explore them, to perhaps experiment with them, but we can make an even larger difference faster than I think we'd ever imagined. And of course we need learning partners who have the capabilities and can work with us. We're doing some pretty cool things at Imperial, and indeed both for ourselves and with the companies we're working with. Hopefully we're putting some of these things into practice. Thank you for staying with me. It's been my honour to share some observations with you. I would very much look forward to your comments, observations, and indeed learnings that you've had in your own business. These are my details, and I look forward to meeting with you, either online or indeed one day soon, I hope, face to face. Thank you.